Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or the more all-encompassing chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell a friend, tell people on social media, and go to the iTunes store. Look up the Virtual Memories Show, leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That might just inspire Apple to promote us a little. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, I've got a quick DC trip Monday into Tuesday, so it's time for another early episode. I don't even know what to tell you about last week and everything that went on. Nothing too significant, but let's go. Trade show in New York City last Tuesday to Thursday. That went well. Not as stressful as the one from 2 weeks earlier. I did get to record next week's show during this New York stay, which was good. That's with Michael Carroll, author of a new collection coming out. I spent Saturday in the city for the Mocha Arts Festival, where I got to catch up with a bunch of past guests and also pitch some upcoming shows, and just get some comics, which is nice. I went on a monster hike and run Sunday morning, today, where I got to enjoy some of the sudden spring weather. I feel like I've turned some sort of corner with running in the past week, maybe because my knee's feeling better, because I took a week off 2 weeks ago, and because I ran up the giant hill on the road into my town, Saturday of last week, and had the realization that so much of what I'm trying to do is more mental than physical. Anyway, that week off seems to have re-energized me. The hotel during this recent New York trip, I just pounded the hell out of the treadmill both mornings I was there in ways that I wasn't able to do previously, or ways that I used to just stop. Then I've now learned to just kind of cool down, restart, and go faster and farther than I ever have, which is kind of neat. I would try the week off thing with the podcast in hopes it would re-energize me for that too, but I'm sort of afraid I'll never come back. Oh, and I also got official word, which I knew but didn't want to say anything about until they announced it. I will be interviewing the cartoonist Seth at the Strand Bookstore in New York City on May 7th. It's in support of Seth's new collection, Clyde Fans, which is published by Drawn and Quarterly and coming out soon. Hit up strandbooks.com, look up the event calendar to find us. You'll need tickets if you plan to attend, so you got to register. But Seth and I have done 2 one-on-one episodes already, both during TCAF, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. So I'm kind of looking forward to this different milieu, like sitting down with him, with an audience, with a New York comics audience. In fact, it'll be my New York debut. That could be something. So anyway, May 7th, Seth is going to be doing a presentation, and then we're going to do interview and then Q&A with the audience. Strand Bookstore, strandbooks.com. Hope to see you there. Anyway, this week's episode which we have to get to, was recorded during my previous business trip to New York a couple of weeks ago, the same one where I recorded last week's episode with Mark Allen Stamety. This session was 2 days later, so my voice is progressively deeper as a result of nonstop business meetings and functions. Plus, we recorded 8:30 in the morning that Wednesday because I had an 11 a.m. that turned into a 10:30 a.m. with one of my member companies from my trade association. Luckily, my guest had never met me before, so he didn't know why I sounded quite so FM radio. That guest is David Shields, author of the new book, The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power, from Mad Creek Books, which is an imprint of the Ohio State University Press. I'm sorry, the Ohio State University Press. The Trouble with Men is a 140-ish page personal essay about David's marriage and the psychological sadomasochistic bent that it's taken on over the decades. David's 62 years old, by the way, that comes up in the context of the conversation. The book is a very intense examination of a very specific marriage, but one, I think, through which we can see facets of our own relationships with all the little nuances and the power games and the unknown or unknowing power games we engage in, the things we don't even know we're doing with our partner over the years. The book's written sort of as a love letter, or a letter at least, to David's wife. But it's also respectful of her in a way that we get into as part of this conversation. While it's supposed to be all about the marriage, it's still about David's perspective of this. And he makes sure not to delve into his wife's history and maybe psyche in a way that would constitute betrayal, but it's more about the gestalt of the two of them and what power does in a occasional vacuum. At least I think none of this constitutes a betrayal. We'll check back in a few months and see how David and his wife are doing. But like a lot of David's essays and nonfiction, this one's a really fascinating read because it employs his literary collage style, where he uses these long quotes or snippets from other people in addition to his own writing. And he attaches attribution at the end of a paragraph when it's someone else's words, which can be a little disconcerting when you start reading and you think you're reading David's perspective, and then you realize this has to be a woman writing this. You get to the end and realize, who it is at the end of that paragraph. But in general, I find you can discern David's words from those of his sources pretty easily once you get rolling in some of these books. Anyway, I enjoyed The Trouble with Men a lot, even if it goes into areas that I would never discuss about my own marriage. And the thing is, that's David's point. You really should check out The Trouble with Men. It goes into more than just this marriage. It goes into all those things in the subtitle, sex, love, marriage, porn, and power, in a way that again forms a gestalt. It's a fascinating book, and I hope you give it a chance. Anyway, caveats. As mentioned, we recorded in my hotel room in Midtown. Unlike last week, I turned off the air conditioning before David came in, so I didn't have to clear out all of that fan noise. Downside, David is much more gesticulative than Mark Allen Stamety, and he thumped the table a few times to accentuate things, so you're going to get all those little bumps. And his throat got scratchy, and you'll pick up on that. And I drank water a few times. You'll hear the gulps. But other than that, pretty clean episode. Here's David's bio from the flap copy of The Trouble with Men. There's a much more extensive version of his bio at his own site, davidshields.com. David Shields is the internationally best-selling author of 22 books, including Reality Hunger, named one of the best books of 2010 by more than 30 publications, The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, a New York Times bestseller, Black Planet, finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Other People, Takes and Mistakes, New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice Selection. The film adaptation of I Think You're Totally Wrong, A Quarrel, was released by First Pond Entertainment in 2017. A recipient of Guggenheim and NEA fellowships and a senior contributing editor of Conjunctions, he has published essays and stories in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Esquire, Yale Review, Salon, Slate, McSweeney's, and Believer. His work has been translated into 24 languages. His new book is The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power, from Mad Creek Books. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with David Shields. My life is an NBA from the work side of things.
That's a great title.
Oh, don't trust me. I've used that.
My life is a great title of a memoir. My life is one big NDA.
Yeah, I have a number of false starts as a failed writer, including that. So, yeah,
that's not a bad line, though.
Yeah. In fact, I should use that as the whole collection of my non-life, as it were. Which actually is sort of where I wanted to start. I passed on your previous book because my day job, I'm also a lobbyist down in Washington for the weird part of the pharma industry that I represent. And I was afraid, geez, doing a podcast about the whole Trump phenomenon might be a problem, given the off chance that anybody on the Hill actually listens to my
right.
show. Now I realize this episode might get me into more trouble.
Exactly.
What with it being, centered on marriage and everything we do and don't talk about our spouses.
That's funny. I mean, that book, the previous book was called Nobody Hates Trump More Than Trump, An Intervention. And this book is called The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power. And in a way, you could cross-wire those two titles, that in a way, the Trump book could easily be called The Trouble with Men, obviously.
Yeah.
And there's a strange way in which this book could be called,
It's an intervention of sorts.
Yeah, or even like Nobody Hates Me More Than Me, that's getting into some pretty dicey territory, but
you do a good job of self-loathing.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know if you saw this morning's New York Times review. That was a rave from Perul Segal, or at least to me it was a rave. But, it's a strange moment where that's a very positive review, but I expose myself first, but she's just talking before, I don't know how many people read the Times, 1.5 million, whatever. It's like, do I really want all this out there? It's a very unnerving experience.
Let me ask, do you laugh? There's a blurb on the back of this saying that you're the most honest writer alive.
Holy Moses, who said that? Somebody, yeah.
John Scoyles.
There you go.
Who I don't know, but, he considers you very honest.
Yeah.
Do you laugh when you read that? Or do you feel that what you're putting out there is honest?
I see what you mean.
I mean, the original,
sort of like,
the opening question I was going to ask was, where did you come up with the protagonist for this new novel? But I decided we shouldn't go meta.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. Well, to me, that's a really interesting question, actually. I mean, I don't want to take back what I've already given, but let me try to cross-wire, Gil, those two questions. The first part is the most honest writer alive. Obviously, some hyperbole there, but I take that as genuine praise. I mean, I do strive for a kind of stripped nakedness is my whole go-to. That's my whole strategy. I was sort of walking up here this morning. I was just thinking, like, what is my project, my literary project? And for better or worse, it's this thing in which I expose my raw nerve endings on the page in a relatively radical way. It's not just memoir or essay, but it's, what was the review this morning? Said something like, he passes the sound barrier of indiscreet disclosure or something like that. So how do you mean, did I laugh, Gil, in the sense that you have no idea what I didn't say, that kind of thing?
Do you feel this is honest? Do you feel that you're artificial in the process of constructing something like this?
I think there's that truth. I mean, I feel like, if I have secrets beyond this, let me know about them, because this is pretty damned naked by my lights. I mean, there's not. But having said that, I would say it's a bit of a construction, isn't it? I guess that, in the book, I phrase myself as self-punishing or something. And basically 90% of me is just this regular person who's pursuing a career, who's relatively happily married, who doesn't go around, cutting myself or anything like that. But To me, there is a poetic thing that writers do, or at least this writer does. If I'm writing about, let's say, race in Black Planet, I pretend I'm absolutely obsessed with all things racial. If I'm writing about mortality, I pretend that I am this death-haunted madman who can't think about anything except the fact that we all once die. Not once die, but we all die.
Once, yeah.
We all die once.
I hope.
Yeah.
Except for Ian Fleming. Oh, never mind. That's bad bunch.
What about you? You mean
you only live twice? Yeah.
And I'm thinking of other books of mine. Like in almost every book, I phrase myself like in Remote. I phrase myself as someone who's madly obsessed with all things mass media or how literature saved my life. I become a kind of literature junkie who's trying to save my life through literature. I think a writer cuts a swath through some part of their psyche and phrases themselves as the whole world turns on this for me. And that gives you a book. It's Captain Ahab chasing that particular whale. So in this book, I'm chasing the whale, as it were, no pun intended, of sex, and that, at this, I mean, to be honest, like at age 62, like, not that that's that old, but like,
well, you said it's more thinking about sex than it is.
If I'm honest, like, am I, every beautiful girl in the street, I'm just thinking at this point, to be honest, she's really beautiful. I'm not thinking, oh, gee, I'm really lusting after her. I don't know if my testosterone is just down these days. I better get my T count checked. But, it's more like, at this point in my life, I want to think about what drives me, what drives us as people, maybe as men, as white men, and that, so anyway, I think your question is really a good one. Part of me digs what John Scoyle says, the most honest writer alive, and I am committed to a project too, I suppose, of radical honesty. Having said that, I think that your implication is a good one, that it's a sculpted persona that has candor as its scheme, but there's all sorts of things that it doesn't account for, that, I walk the dog and take out the garbage and, am a boring middle-class person, so.
That's the nothing but epiphanies approach that characterize Reality Hunger and some of the subsequent work.
Right.
Life isn't nothing but epiphanies. So, figuring out what needs excising and or where to find perhaps to find the epiphany in walking the dog.
Right. I mean, it's sort of the personal essay form, like in a novel, say, or in perhaps a standard memoir, but especially in a novel, the drama is Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are fighting over the crown and their marriage. It's two people actually butting heads, or Othello and Iago are at loggerheads, or whatever the example is. But in a work of book-length personal essay, as my books tend to be, book-length essay, let's call it, the argument is, in my view, kind of a warfare within the breast of the speaker, of the author, of the narrator. And so, as you say, the whole thing is epiphanies, so the whole thing is fraught with emotional drama, I hope, line by line. The way that I write is to try to make it so that every page is this nervous psychic journey. And that's, for better or worse, my shtick, to try to take the reader on a serious existential excavation.
Given the focus on your, we'll say, psychological masochism, as opposed to any physical side of it.
No, it really, book. I mean, that's, I'm here to say that
I tried to explain
there is no dungeon in the basement of the Shields home. Yes.
Yeah, I was explaining to one of my pharma people when they asked if I was going to be doing any podcasts during this show. Yeah, it's an interesting novel, or book. It's about a marriage that sort of becomes an S&M thing, but not in a sex and physical way, more in the quirky psychological sense. But in that respect of your masochism.
Were you actually telling him or her this?
Yeah, I actually said this to like pharma related.
Were they
people.
backing off? Or
no,
like,
they were.
Okay,
the guy was
Gil,
like,
I'll see you later.
Kind of interesting, because they know I don't, do this stuff too frivolously.
Right.
But in that respect, though, when you mention reading a review like the New York Times piece, I know writers who avoid reading or say they avoid reading any reviews of their work. Do you look for the negative line or the qualifier?
I think that's, a friend of mine.
Do you hope for that sort of, there'll
qualifier?
be a knife in there too?
No, I mean, I think that, the review was sort of funny this morning where she says, David will probably like it if I am mean, but this is actually a very, positive review, so sorry. But, that I think, first of all, it's a total, I don't know, perhaps if you're this world-bestriding colossus who is reviewed around the world because you have all these books out in every country, and the reviews come in to your agents from all over the world on a daily level, at a certain point that you stop reading every review. And, I don't read every word of every review, and I think a long time ago I wrote an essay about, I don't know if you have read that essay in my book, Other People, Takes, and Mistakes, in which I look up every bad review of my first 5 books as a psychological experiment to see what I would learn. And if I could sort of almost absorb it and come out sane at the other end. It was a really interesting emotional experiment, to be honest. And a friend of mine who's a writer, I would really recommend that you have on your show, Sarah Manguso. I don't know if you know Sarah's work.
I've seen her quoted in your work, but I've never read her.
She's an amazing writer. But Sarah says that she has a wonderful line that she read earlier drafts of this book and read the final draft of it and came to, I think, like the book a lot. But she said, I thought she had she goes, maybe all writers are bottoms as opposed to tops in a sexual sense. Yeah. And that basically, I don't know if one can extrapolate that as a truth, but in the book I actually say, is there a major modernist writer who wasn't flagrantly masochistic? And I sort of tick them off. I mean, Virginia Woolf, Proust, Thomas Mann, Kafka, Joyce, I'm forgetting one person, certainly Faulkner, T.S. Eliot. I mean, if you just read their correspondence, they were often not only emotionally masochistic, but often quite overtly sexually so. I mean, just look at Joyce's letters to Nora are, Exhibit A. And I think that's, we could argue whether that's in fact true. One could probably think of famously sadistic writers, obviously. Marquise de Sade would be an example of someone who was sadistic, but the one could easily argue these poles reverse on themselves. Yeah. Anyone who is as sadistic as de Sade was on some level profoundly masochistic. To me, these are not opposites so much as dialectics. So anyway, why would someone hold themselves up in a room for a year or two, write a book, especially in 2019, in which the lingua franca of the culture is not the written word, that much.
Right.
The whole burden of literature, isn't it, is to explore emotional complexity and awkwardness, sadness. I mean, the literature by its definition is about sadness. That there's that famous line, happiness stains the page white, i.e. if you're happy, you tend not to write and the page stays blank. So I don't know if the way that you're looking at me, Gil, suggests you want to push back against this idea, which you're certainly welcome to.
No.
Do you think that's is that, can one think of writers who are famously not bottoms? I'm sure that one can. But I think the writers are drawn toward the fly in the ointment. That's what makes them writers, I think.
Well, it was just something that got me wondering when you mentioned that dialectic between the S and the M, whether that's at the core of this book, or the thing that struck me, and spoiler alert, it's from the last page of the book. We don't want to give away too much.
No, you can't. Go for it.
Is a dialectic between what's vulnerability and what's weakness?
That's really lovely.
Or how you as as a vulnerable / weak person,
Right.
see yourself and are seen.
I mean, I don't know if there's a question there so much as a really good observation. I think that your point is there, I know what you mean. Like, to me, vulnerability, there's a wonderful graffito I saw and texted it to my daughter, which it said something like, vulnerability is my superpower. And I just thought that was so beautiful that,
I told Walter Kern anxiety is my drug of choice, which really flustered him, but,
Walter's a friend.
Yeah.
Walter's great. Wait, say your line again?
He was surprised to find that I had no addiction issues, or I was able to quit drinking in one day and never went back. He said, you just haven't found your drug of choice yet. And I realized late in the conversation, anxiety is my drug of choice. And
interesting.
That
Walter, I think he's a recovered alcoholic, and he's quite upfront about that. And he's become a really good friend. I have a great story about Walter, just that he wrote, as I think he must remember, he wrote a really negative review of my book, Remote, 20 years ago in New York Magazine. And apparently, so disliked the book, he wrote a second review in a sort of year-end thing of like, here are my 5 least favorite books of
books
the
to
year.
Continue avoiding.
Thanks, Walter. Thanks for sharing. And then I hadn't been in touch with him. I mean, that was maybe, 25 years ago. And then relatively recently at the Tin House Writers Conference in Portland, Oregon, Walter and I were both teaching there. And I feel like that for once in my life, I did the emotionally intelligent thing. Namely, I never brought up the review. And through a mutual friend who had also recommended you have on, Melanie Thernstrom, who's a wonderful writer, that she just sort of introduced us. She's friends with Walter and she's friends with me. And we never talked about that particular review. And we've become really good friends. But anyway, I forgot the weakness and vulnerability, and that, one can't be at least the essayistic writer I am without being extraordinarily vulnerable, and is that a kind of weakness? There's that wonderful Philip Lopate, who's the editor of this wonderful book called The Art of the Personal Essay. He has this, the introduction is extraordinary and changed my writing life as I moved from becoming a fiction writer to a nonfiction writer, a personal essayist, where he says something like, self-confident, smug types might become news anchors and politicians. They tend not to become writers. And I just think that's it to me. That, I might admire sort of people who present themselves in a very self-possessed kind of Clintonian way. But I always think of that as a total mask, and that I have the bravery / stupidity to phrase my conflicts in the public eye. So, yeah.
So weakness is sort of the toxic masculinity perspective on vulnerability?
Well,
the bad way of seeing it, basically.
Right. I thought, not to endlessly lean into this morning's review, but
it's the New York Times.
Yeah, So, it's on our minds. I saw it last night online, but, but anyway, Perul Segal wrote a very thoughtful review and thought of it as, very much about me. But to me, the title of the book is relevant, The Trouble with Men. I'm using myself as maybe a relatively extreme test case. And there's a crucial line in the book which speaks to your question, Gil. It's a line from Antonio Porcia, the Italian-Argentinian aphorist, who says, man is weak, and when he makes strength his profession, he is weaker. Mm-hmm. Man is weak, and when he makes strength his profession, he is weaker. And one could hardly think of Trump as a perfect example of that, which is the argument that my Trump book makes, that he's obviously, to me, an utterly broken human being has been broken from a very young age. I'm not the first person to point out that he's can't feel anything and hasn't been able to feel anything for a very long time. And absurdly, he phrases himself as this strong man. He's not, there are people who are actually strong. He is not that person. And the more he makes strength his profession, the more manifestly weak Trump seems to me. Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question or if there's a...
my whole world's about digressions.
Yeah.
And non-disclosure, as we've said. But
yeah. But, basically, weakness, vulnerability, I think that your point is... I was sort of walking up here to our interview. I was thinking, am I okay with this book? Because now it's really out there. The Washington Post reviewed it, The Guardian, but the Times, because I'm in New York now, and it's like, okay, it's not like everyone in the street has just read this review, but, and I kept thinking, like, I'm okay with this. I'm totally okay with this. I'm really proud of the book. And the book quotes this line of Harold Broadkey's, which is something like, I don't understand the point of privacy. Mm-hmm. I think, that we'll all be dead quite soon. This is our one chance to learn something about life on Earth. I'm just really imbued with his idea is why all the masks? Not to say that the book isn't also masked, that I'm not employing a mask speaking to you this very moment. I'm sort of playing.
But the purpose of it is different than the masks we tend to put on.
And why, this whole thing, every person, after they die, we come out, Edgar Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser and X was a Y and Y was a Z. And it's like, really? And, there are obviously political and cultural reasons that certain people stay closeted. But, I do love this idea of David Foster Wallace, who was asked, what's so great about literature? And he said, that we're existentially alone on the planet. I can't know what you're thinking, and you can't know what I'm thinking and feeling. Literature at its best is a bridge built across the existential abyss of human loneliness. This is our one chance to communicate as fully as possible. And that's, to me, a really beautiful definition of literature, and the kind of literature that I'm drawn toward writing and reading makes that exchange the very center of the book, so that, you really do get to know some part of me in this book, for better and worse.
One of the, to me, fascinating aspects of it, first, in the very idea that it's written as a love letter to your wife.
A tough love letter, yes.
Yeah. And it's about you. I mean, she's there, but as reflected by her behavior towards you, as opposed to, as much as it's, we'll just say bracingly honest about you and who you are, she's only seen as the reflection. There's no, my wife acts like this, and it's because of, something.
Her own psychology, right.
Yeah. And I'm interested in that notion, how much, again, that incommensurability, I suppose, of human experience, or the sensitivity about not talking about your wife in a way that she would divorce you, played into structuring it like that. And again, well, I mean, it also ties into the Uma Thurman's dad quote you've got.
I love that line,
with, where you ask afterwards, will men ever see women as real? Were you concerned about that in the term of in the process of constructing this, that you weren't giving her agency, I suppose, as it were?
That's fascinating. I think you've hit on something crucial, and that you've connected it nicely to the Uma Thurman line. I think that was a Maureen Dowd article about Uma Thurman at the time, sort of CAA and Tarantino and some sort of Me Too accusations. But, this book went through various iterations, for sure, which I think I even talk about in the book itself. I tried to write it as a novel where a husband and wife share their sexual fantasies. In a way, I feel like Nichols and Baker had sort of done that, and You and I, or not in You and I,
Well,
in Vox.
Yeah, except never mind.
Except what? It's only a couple on a phone sex thing.
Yeah, and he has no ear for dialogue.
And as I say in the book, it's very anodyne in the sense that it's...
There are a lot of flaws with that book.
There
I
are.
thought, really? This is supposed to be...
The big hot book? It's about as hot as a cold shower. I know what you mean, like... But
I'm very glad to see you, dismissing that at the same time.
I do. That I love Nichols and Baker's work in the sense that I love his book You and I love some of Baker's work a lot. But those, I think, as they say, writing is writing, publishing, it's timing in the sense that the Nichols and Baker's book came out when I think that phone sex was relatively new phenomenon in the
early
culture.
90s,
and then
late
he
80s.
He smartly and. It has the feel of him writing it in 6 weeks. It has that, like he just wrote it quickly, and it just, it flows kind of. And, that Monica Lewinsky gave it to Bill Clinton, and that, the rest is history, as they say. And so, but anyway, I tried to write my book as a novel where maybe a husband and wife might stay up all night trying to save their marriage or resuscitate their marriage by telling each other their deepest emotional needs and drives, including sexual stuff. I think that could be a good book. I don't know if I'm the person to write that book in the sense that I'm not much of a fiction writer anymore. As you may know from having read some of my earlier stuff, I wrote 3 novels, trying to write my 4th novel, and couldn't quite write it as a fiction and have been a writer of nonfiction the last 20 plus years. And then I tried to write it as, I can't even remember the various versions. I think in many times, frankly, I tried not to write the book. This took me many, many years of writing and throwing out. At one point I had literally thousands of pages of notes and drafts. And it's sort of the best book I could write. I think it wasn't as if I consciously said, I'm not going to make the you character as fully fleshed as I can. I think it wasn't a conscious walling off of her from the reader's view, I don't think. But of course, my wife did vet the book in the sense that after I had finished the book, with, as you can probably imagine, tremendous trepidation. Yeah. I showed her the book, and, I thought that she knew I had been writing the book because, I don't know, I thought it was so, I just thought that she did. In the way she's very intuitive. Why is that funny for you?
I'm just imagining, this is what you were writing this whole time? That sort of,
that's what you're down there in the basement doing? I mean, and that...
I thought you were just watching porn, which ties into the book too.
But it's sort of like, just because I just thought she had seen a page or two as, it flowed through the house. But, she, as I say, I think I forget if I say in the book or in a later essay I wrote was, at first she asked for a few small changes, and then she finally just said, it's your book. You can do with it as you want, but I don't want to discuss it in public in any way. I don't have any comment in public. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, that she doesn't really want to talk about the book that much, which I thought it was this book to deepen the marriage, maybe naively. Like, here's the things that I am thinking about. And, either challenge the marriage or deepen it or complicate it, possibly threaten the marriage. And it's sort of this perfect epilogue. And women tend to get this more than men. It's, of course, Lori, I guess I don't know if I should say her name. Yeah. Whoops.
My wife.
My wife didn't want to talk about the book that much. But to me, amazingly, she was okay, reluctantly, with me publishing it, which I found a fascinating paradox. Yeah. And speaks to her character. She wasn't going to rob me of the chance to write it and publish it. But neither was she going to engage with the book in exactly the way that I wanted. But it's that very lack of engagement with my emotional issues
that's actually driving the core of the book.
Which challenged the book, which I thought was so perfect.
I'm going to keep twisting you because you're the masochist here, and
something like that. And yet that wasn't conscious on her part. I think it was her actual nature
and characteristic of the relationship as you depict it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it reminds me of two pop culture things, both from Long Island. I'm a New Jersey guy, so Long Island is,
around the corner.
Yeah. One is the moment from the Howard Stern movie, Private Parts, where his wife is driving with a couple of neighbors or real estate people or something, and his show is on, and they're all looking, and she's nervously just saying, "It's just an act. It's okay." And I'm not a fan of Seinfeld in particular, but the Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee series of interviews, my wife and I were watching one. I forget who the guest was, but Seinfeld mentions women will talk to each other about their husband or partner in life. Men do not do that.
That's the
and my
myth.
Wife was floored by this because that's completely no.
Was she saying it's true?
She was stunned. She said, "Yeah, no, my neighbors and I will talk about you and husband X and husband Y." I'm like, the funny thing, if I'm sitting with husband X and husband Y, we're talking about the Yankees, or we're talking about politics, whatever. At no point would we ever discuss any of you wives because
it's too nervous making.
I think it's a game theory thing. There are two things that could happen. One is one of them will mention something to his wife, and it will get back to my wife, and I will be, hit by a nuclear bomb, or I will lose face because I will say something that the other men are. Wait a second. You let your wife do that?
Exactly.
And so there's no win situation to come out of this.
It's a really great point.
I know, and it sounds like the 1950s, and yet it's still true.
I think guys, we're back to Portia. Man is weak, and when he makes strength his profession, he is weaker. That men, in my experience, are much more fragile than women are.
Right.
And I think the myth, which I try to unpack briefly through my friend in the book, Brenda Phillips, who says the myth is that women talk far more than men about, as it were, blow by blow, sexual things with men. And she says that's not actually true.
I recall in the book.
And that, I don't know, we'd have to interview 10,000 women, which I'd be happy to do, the anthropological voyeur I am. I think the idea, I definitely know that men tend not to talk to each other about,
anything emotional.
Well, not even emotionally, sexual, like, what do you guys do in bed together?
Yeah.
Like, that would never come
Not in
up.
a million years.
Not like there's no freaking way.
Right.
And I think a lot of people would be appalled that in this book I sort of say what my sexual nature is. It's not hugely
It's not graphic.
explicit.
No, I've published Samuel Delaney before. I've dealt with graphics. So yeah, nothing in here is, that. Yeah.
I love that memoir of Delaney's. What's the
the motion of light and water. Yeah.
I love that book. Yeah. I love that book. You published Delaney in what context?
I published a collection of his letters from 1984, and then I reissued his scatological queer literary theory porno novel, The Madman. We've been friends for more than 20 years now. He's been on the show also. We did one of these.
Delaney's great.
Yeah.
But that I don't even.
But he was the first real man I was ever pals with. And,
right.
Yeah.
I can imagine Delaney's letters. My God, they might make Cheever's letters look like.
Well, this was, I was with a previous girlfriend, reading the letters themselves as I'm getting ready to work on them for publishing, and I just start laughing. And she's like, "What is it?" I said, "Honey, we've all had casual sex in our life." She's like, "Yeah." I said, "Have you ever had completely anonymous sex with 6 to 12 people over the course of 4 hours in a movie theater in Times Square?" She's just staring at me aghast. I'm like, "That's our friendship. That's and that's just a day in the office, just on the cusp."
Day in the office, yeah.
Just on the cusp of AIDS becoming something, but it was still that scene in Times Square in New York in the late 70s and early 80s. And recording one with Edmund White recently, it was dude, nothing shocks me. I've sat with Samuel Delaney before. I've heard these stories. I know how insane things got.
Right.
But yeah, it's as anytime we think we're doing something decadent or extreme, we're just white people from the suburbs. Ultimately, we really don't know how.
And also that
weird things get.
I mean, that we're like, why would anything be like anything that you've thought of? Other human beings have also probably thought of, and that we're just, I mean, it's not exactly a brilliant new idea, but that we're just irreducibly animals. And so if people have animal drives, whether it's toward just having sex or
any weird perversions or peccadillos,
portraying their emotional dramas through sexual maneuvers. I mean, what's that line very late in the book, which I mean, so many of my favorite lines come from other people, but
we should note the book is written in a collage style, which is characteristic of your work for a number of years now. So it's a lot of quotes from other people.
Right.
So he's not just quoting himself.
No, exactly. When I say it's a wonderful line, it tends to be from someone else.
To paraphrase myself.
Exactly. What is that line? I won't chew up.
No, while you're looking for that, I'll share something else as a corollary to what we were just discussing, because we're sitting in a hotel room while I'm doing business travel, and one of my beliefs is, this is a piece of advice for anyone listening, everything in your hotel room has been used by a lonely traveler for a demented sexual purpose.
That's a great line.
Don't touch the remote. Bring alcohol wipes with you. It should be your standard operating procedure anytime you're traveling. And now, back to the show.
If there's your next poem title. I mean, that is a great line, Gil.
Oh, my collection is haiku for business travelers. That's
I swear to God.
I actually wrote something.
What was that line, Gil? Like, everything in your
hotel room has been used by a lonely traveler for a demented sexual purpose.
I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's just a fantastic line. And to me, the whole problem is, it's basically, again, I'm quoting from this book, this guy who says something like, anytime we label something a perversion, it almost always is just a sexual desire that I don't have.
Right.
Like, basically, fellatio used to be labeled a sexual perversion, believe it or not. That was thought to be perverse.
Yeah.
And so...
Only if you do it right.
Exactly. Well, that's the Woody Allen line. Sex is dirty only when you do it right. And so, anyway... I don't even understand, anyone who would think anything being particularly problematic. Obviously, the book doesn't argue for any kind of sexual misconduct or violation that isn't between consensual adults. All that is not the purview of this particular book. It's between two consenting adults. And, that the epigraph of the book is really crucial. Everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. I mean, that is just such a powerful line. If you put two animals in a room, two dogs, two cats, two hamsters, there will be subtly an argument, a quarrel, a physical shuffling for submission and dominance. There just will. And it just is a sadness, a sweetness, a tragedy between people that we find between ourselves subtle submission and dominance postures. And again, quoting from the book, this scholar who says, that one of the real last taboos in the culture, and I think it's still a relative taboo, is male submissiveness. That it's not like I'm not aware of any book, to be honest, by a straight white male, such as myself, who acknowledges his slight or not so slight tendency, not toward dominance, which is sort of the default male position, but to someone who is drawn emotionally, psychologically toward submission. Like that's this major cultural taboo. And to me, the book is an attempt to break that particular taboo.
And the use of the collage style for this? I mean, you'd mentioned considering this as a novel initially, which surprised me because you seemed averse to, based on your past bunch of books, averse to, pursuing that mode yourself.
Well, the novel was an attempt to do a workaround around the fact that I was probably going to be writing about my marriage. So the novel was a sort of last gasp attempt.
Yeah, making it fictional might help. Okay. But where did the collage thing originate for you? I say the collage thing as though it's just, hey, you hipster. But
a passing fad. But collage, God, that's a long thing. But basically, I was trying to write my fourth novel, 20 years ago. And for some reason, I could not write the conventional novel. I was trying to write in, the mid-90s, a book about mass media and American kitsch and about pop culture and mass media. And I was trying to write about it in a way. It was a precursor of the book that we're now talking about. I was trying to write about a couple, a man and woman, perhaps boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife, who were both perhaps obsessed with mass media and defined themselves and each other according to the strictures of mass media, sort of judging themselves and judging each other against the sort of airbrush standards of mass culture. And I just could not write that book as a novel. I was trying to make, I think, the husband a film critic or TV critic. I was trying to make the wife a high school teacher. And all the sort of brickwork of laying the foundations of the novel struck me as very tedious and very irrelevant to what I wanted to explore. And so that book broke into 1,000 shattered fragments. That book became my first book of literary collage called Remote Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity. 52 short chapters, each one sort of collage-like, the whole book being rather collage-like. And ever since, to be honest, I've written that way to, I think, my slight or not so slight commercial detriment. I don't know how many people love that form. It's the way that I read, it's the way I write, it's the way that I think. I'm trying to think of what else to say about it, Gil. I mean, do you struggle with the form a bit? Do you find it a little hard to follow?
Well, depending on whether I look to the end of the paragraph to figure out if it's you, somebody else, who the other person is that you're quoting. Right. But it reminds me ultimately of, I was insane enough back in the blogging era to do something called Monday Morning Montaigne, where I actually read an essay every week starting from the beginning and wrote about it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's also a sign that, I really needed a social life, which I still haven't picked up on. That's why I have this instead. But Montaigne, to a more limited extent, he'll be paragraph of his own, and then, somebody else's, quote Seneca and all these other figures, because the greater wisdom was already expounded.
Totally.
And, it's why an old Tumblr I used to keep was called Montaigne's Library, until I wrote the single greatest post I will ever write, and I decided I could never follow that one up, and I may as well just close down the site from there. I've adapted it into a poem in the zine that I will never publish, but there are degrees where other people's wisdom makes more sense. Similarly, there's especially coming out of that 80s into 90s era where we had the post-Burroughs fragmented, mass media style as the internet's just starting to catch on.
I think it's really crucial.
Yeah.
I think it's really crucial that I definitely don't think it's a coincidence that I wrote a very traditional novel in the 80s, a slightly less traditional novel in the late 80s, a slightly less traditional novel still in the early 90s. And then as, the mid-90s start to emerge, I moved back to the West Coast from living around here for almost 20 years. And first there's, something called, basically wall-to-wall cable TV, which at a certain point seemed like a very big deal that you'd have a 24-hour news cycle. And that seemed to me to change things. And that was, of course, nothing compared.
Little did we know.
Yeah, that was, that was the golden age of thoughtful meditation by comparison. And so that I think it's not a coincidence that my work has gotten more and more pointillistic and cubistic and compressed and concise and velocity driven. I don't know if I'm just spending too much time on the web or whether I'm alert to, I'm a sort of early warning system for attention deficit disorder.
I was going to ask if you tried Ritalin at any point.
Exactly. But, and that, I think it's sort of just, I love what Nadine Gordimer says, which is she says a writer needs to impose his or her consciousness on the time in which they live. And that, that glacially paced, background saturated, unified work of literary art in which characters have sort of a Freudian psychology and their background lineage really matters, and we have a huge backstory about them. And the novel feels as carefully and slowly paced and plotted as a novel by Balzac from the early 19th century. That just strikes me as a book that isn't even trying to capture what it's like to be alive and thinking now. And so in a way, I do think that my work for the last 20 years, as it's gotten more velocity-driven and turbocharged and speedier and more jam-packed, I do think that is the effect of, too much Twitter, too much texting. But I think people who don't, say, respond to my work, they think of it as maybe a sort of glorified Twitter feed. And people who maybe like my work, or readers who warm to it, find it sort of an excitingly contemporary discourse. And, to each their own.
Well, you can use Twitter or Instagram or one of those, microblogging sites to. It was a problem early on when there was 140 characters and you're trying to get a quote out from a book, but just taking a picture of a page and posting that and trying to get that wisdom across to people, seems of a piece with, what you were predicting essentially without explicitly predicting. The literature I want to ask you about, because I just reread it in a mad binge, and it strikes me as weirdly contemporary, even though it's 3,000 pages long. Anthony Pohl's Dance to the Music of Time, which a few years ago I read one per month for 12 months because I knew I would never be able to do. This time I read it in the span of 6 weeks. I just blew my way through it.
Were you on vacation, or how did you have
My life has no vacations. Basically, I was a few weeks ahead on the podcast, and that's vacation enough for me. But the way that's written, in which the narrator, who is a character, nonetheless tells you almost nothing about himself and just reflects all of these different people's lives threading in and out of each other over the span of 50 years. Weirdly, it seems to have some resonance with what you're doing. I'm not sure. It's almost something.
So that's because I must
admit, thinking of it now as you were describing it.
I've never read Pohl, to be honest.
It's a little slow early on,
right?
But you get the totality of people's lives.
I love
characters who you think are going to be the leads throughout this book either die or disappear partway through, and it basically runs from like post World War I through the late 60s, early 70s, and people are lost in London during the war who you think are going to be the most pivotal people, and someone who was a great figure to him, to the narrator, is just one-liner near the end of one of the books saying that, and that was the same day that his plane was shot down, and that's the last time the guy gets mentioned.
Sounds exciting.
It's weird, but it's.
I've just, for some reason, I've never picked it up. I've always
there are many
loved
reasons
the
not to
idea
pick
of
it up. It's a
Right.
commitment when you see 4 collected volumes of 3,000
Well,
pages.
the book, I mean, the 2 books that surround that book, before and after it, for me, I mean, it sounds like every writer's cliche, but for me, it's actually true. The book that made me a writer in many ways is Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. You know, that is the crucial book to me, which I read throughout graduate school, backwards and forwards. I was just so excited by what that book could do, and it very much works like the Pohl book does. I mean, it's hard not to think of those.
They're written different, and they're usually compared to each other, but they're very different writing styles. But yeah.
So anyway, I felt like having read and loved and been transformed by Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, for some reason, stupidly or perhaps lazily, I've never brought myself to read Pohl's Dance to the Music of Time. And then on the other side, I've become a huge fan of an incredible book, which I sort of name check now and then, by Simon Gray, called The Smoking Diaries. This incredible
which I hadn't heard of before you mentioned it.
It's an amazing book. I think I'm just getting to know you slightly, but I think you would really like it. It's called The Smoking Diaries. It's 4 volumes. The first one's just called Smoking Diaries. Then there's one called anyway, I forget the other subtitles of the other versions, but it works not dissimilarly from what you said the Pohl book does, where it's basically diaries that Simon Gray kept during the last 10 years of Gray's life. And he was a sort of middle-brow, middling successful playwright. Hard to think of an American example. He's definitely better than Neil Simon, but not Arthur Miller or Tennessee Williams or Edward Albee, somewhere in between, somehow sort of Albee and Neil Simon, if one can imagine such a thing. And he was very close friends with Harold Pinner, who, of course, won the Nobel Prize in literature, and was, I mean, their friendship throughout, and talk about submission and dominance, their friendship is unbelievably interesting, in which Gray always takes a slightly one-down position to Pinter, and yet I found Pinter the immensely more likable and winning presence. But in any case, that's just this amazing book to me, where Gray, around age 65 to the end of his life at about 73, writes these 4 volumes over 1,000 pages in which he is meditating on a life's accomplishments, regrets, recriminations, and above all, encroaching mortality. And I'm making the book sound rather vague and rather general and shapeless, but each book is an unbelievably careful meditation on a dedicated theme. And anyway, they're really extraordinary books and very, very collage-like. But thanks for recommending again the Pohl. I definitely promise to try them.
Yeah, early on it'll be slow going in a weird way, but there is a thread of masochism that runs throughout that entire book that you're going to sit back and, how did I miss this for 62 years? There's a central figure to it who encapsulates and has a marriage that encapsulates a bunch of your themes in here. That I won't say any more, but you'll come back and, oh man, I should have had this under my belt. But it's a commitment too. So.
They call it the British disease or something. Anyway.
Well, that's how I wanted to also characterize it. Proust is French and queer, and Anthony Pohl is British and straight, and those are 2 very different approaches to the same sort of project.
Right.
But when I ask about the reaction of your wife to this, it occurs to me only as we were talking, because I'm a man without kids, that there is a third family member tied to this thing. Your daughter and her response to
I know what you mean.
Doing this, or
I mean, I know
she's not a figure in this.
No,
but
she's mentioned occasionally, very obliquely, that she's now 25 and she lives here, and that's a fascinating thing. I won't necessarily draw a veil of secrecy around it, but, I've mentioned the book obliquely to her a long time ago. I just sort of said, I'm writing this book.
Yeah.
I just sort of have mentioned to her.
Yeah.
And then, it's important. I mean, it's interesting. It's important to my wife that, she's sort of hoping the book flies under the radar. And last night, I nearly
New York Times.
I nearly texted her like, "Hi, honey, good news, bad news. Good news, rave review in the Times. Bad news, rave review in the Times." Sort of like, and so my daughter lives and works here in the design world, and so I would think someone will point out the review to her. I haven't told her the book's out, and I don't know what to say. I'm happy to answer the question, but it's sort of this weird official, I forget how they say it, that will agree. I will neither deny nor confirm.
Plausible deniability.
Yeah, like it's almost like, basically, if she wanted to talk about the book, I'd be more than welcome to talk about, or happy to talk about. I think the point I'm trying to get to is that basically my wife has asked me not to talk about the book with our friends. If someone comes over, she sort of says, I just don't want to talk about it, which is interesting. And again, very characteristic of the person as presented here. And she's a fascinatingly stoic figure and a sort of, in a way, a somewhat nonverbal figure or an anti-verbal figure. I'm very much the sort of female talker, and she's very much the male kind of strong, silent killer type. But anyway, my daughter, I think following my wife's request, I'm not going to bring it up to my daughter, but I'm seeing her on Thursday, and so tomorrow. So, I'm just there to talk about it, and it could be that she won't mention it. I feel like there's this sort of agreement that we pretend it doesn't exist in this strange way, which I find.
Did it impact your writing at all? I assume, not being a parent, I don't know the factors that go into that in terms of defining a marriage and what it is. I know those theoretically.
Sure.
But do those threads play out in terms of what you don't say? Not explicitly
you mean in terms
about
of a marriage or about a daughter?
I think not explicitly about having a kid and having a daughter in particular.
Yeah.
But the unspoken dynamic, I guess, in terms of what it means to a marriage.
Yeah, those are huge questions. I think.
Sorry.
Again, that's probably my next book. Thank you for giving me my next book. I think the dirty little secret that most writers who are parents know, I'm not sure this is always true, but it tends to be true, is that children are famously uninterested in their parents' emotional lives, especially their writerly works. Like, a lot of writers, I'm trying to think, I can just think of dozens of writers, friends of mine who happen to be parents who, and my daughter happens to be a graphic novelist and graphic memoirist herself. And so that she in her own work is increasingly exploring not dissimilar material to the very material that this book explores. And part of me, in my sort of talk about everything till you're blue in the face mode, would love to say to her, honey, this book is a kind of burn all boats attempt to explore a self-defeating or somewhat self-punishing mode in myself. If there are elements of your life that you'd want to, I just think you would learn something from it. Apparently that's not.
Yeah, I think from the kid's perspective, it's I've seen that for 25 years, Dad. I don't need it.
Yeah, exactly. But basically, right. And so basically, what's my point? My point is that apparently my instructions are, don't bring it up with friends. If it gets reviewed, so be it. I hope the book does well, but I don't really want to talk about it. And that would implicitly include our daughter, who, if she wants to talk about it, I'm happy to, but I'll leave that be.
Is there any way in which parenting served as a corrective for your own childhood?
Wow, that's powerful.
Again,
I think
not being a dad,
Sure.
I wonder if this is something that parents...
In what sense? I mean...
Well, it's also of a piece, the way the character is related in the book. Masochism ultimately stems from a very stern and abusive mother. And your mother died when you were in college, I believe.
Early, freshman year of college.
There's two questions there. A, is there any aspect of parenting that helped you correct any of the issues that you went through as a child, or simply avoid those, as a basic thing? And secondarily, if your mother had not died when you were younger, do you feel there's any possibility you would have been able to learn anything from her that would have reconciled the damage you underwent? Which leads to the tertiary question, which you bring up in the book on a number of occasions: do I even want to be healed?
Right.
This is a lot of stuff. We only have about 20 minutes left. But
exactly. No, I mean, there's so... My God, let's see.
I know you weren't expecting this at 8:30 in the morning. But.
No, it's fine. Let's start with the last one, which, in a way, is the way that the Times review ended the review, is who would want to be healed, in the sense that every writer... that whole idea of Rilke's, that if they take away my demons, they'll also take away my angels. And that, which is why Rilke decided never to be psychoanalyzed at the time, of Freud and all that. Sure. Everybody in Germany was being psychoanalyzed. So, I think that's an interesting point. Do I stoke my wounds, if that's the right phrase? Do I make sure I'm never going to be totally flattened out, so that's not a huge danger. But, so I think, in general, the book clearly makes an argument that what fuels me, what fuels a lot of writers, is damage. It just is. That's sort of artistic cliche number one, that I'm hugely drawn to this formulation of Edmund Wilson's called The Wound and the Bow, that he says out of the very wound of the writer fashions a bow, like Philoctetes, who takes from his own wound and makes of it a bow of art. And so that answers the tertiary question. I must admit I'm forgetting the secondary.
The intermediate one is, if your mom had lived, whether you feel the person you grew into would have been able to get some sort of reconciliation out of her. Do you feel that was even a possibility based on who she was and who you were?
I don't want to overstate the case. She wasn't, she was, a difficult, emotional person. I think if she had lived now, I'm not sure that she would have really wanted children, that she was sort of a person who was born in 1925, had a really horrible marriage, and, in a way, I was in some ways the repository for her frustration at being married to my father, whom I, in certain ways, emotionally resembled, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think that's, without retreating to a politician's, that I don't answer hypotheticals. I mean, that strikes me as slightly hypothetical, okay, if she had lived, that she could conceivably still be alive now, that she'd be 94, I think it would be. And, people live to 94. Who knows what emotional rapprochement I would have had with her. But I think you are right, that somehow of her dying, even as I was coming into my maturity, there was a lot of stuff that needed to be worked out that never did. And so that gets to, in a way, your primary question. I think, in many ways, I think that is right. I think if I were honest, I would say part of my motivation to have children, a child, was that, I wanted the emotional nourishment that actually brought me, the way it might transform me and move me on beyond what seemed like the relatively real cathexis of my childhood. And I guess if you read the book, you could say, okay, dude, you still have some emotional baggage that you're dealing with. But again, I would argue this is to come back to the earlier stuff, this is a relatively extreme version of myself. That this is, yes, I'm being honest, but this is, I would say, an exaggerated version of my psychological life.
You could try distillation.
Yeah, that's not a
distilled
bad word.
version. It's exaggerated,
Exactly.
kind of
That's
gives the
a very good word. Thing distilled is, or perhaps crystallized. Exactly.
Yeah.
Distilled is good. And so basically, yeah, I think I can't even imagine myself without my daughter or my wife. That, I think to the degree I'm a grown up, to the degree I'm, what did I recently write to my daughter in a dedication to a book? I just said, it's kind of melodramatic, but I just said, you saved my life. She saved my life. Like, she really, she taught me to love the world and love life. She's a huge part of my emotional life.
We'll have to get her on the show sometime just so she can talk smack about you.
There you go.
I've got the comics background.
Yeah, exactly. She's published a first graphic memoir. She has a second one coming out.
See, it's right up my alley.
There you go.
We haven't even touched on the sports stuff, which, in fact, when I recorded with Jerome Charan...
I know he's a big sports guy, yeah.
Yeah, we ended up spending about 15 minutes on the NBA, which I don't think his publicist was ecstatic about, but, we had a good time talking, where we did have the question of whether LeBron should have gone to Philly instead of L.A.
Wow.
Yeah.
Philly.
As an East Coast guy in particular, he would have approved that because he could actually watch the games instead of
right.
West Coast.
Right.
But I want to ask for you, given the Seattle aspect, the sports fixation, and the masochism.
Oh, no. Here we go.
What hurt more? The Seahawks losing the Super Bowl in that last second play by the Patriots, or the Seahawks winning the Super Bowl earlier? Because when they're actually on top, that's got to be more damaging for a masochism.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. I mean, I think, again, that's a bit of... There we're back to crystallization and distillation. That, I'm not so...
You don't need them to lose every time. I
need them to win every time. I'm just a boring sports fan, like a lot of guys and girls, And so I was just, ecstatic when they won Super Bowl 48, and of course, just inconsolable with that, just impossible to improve upon, the second and goal from the one, against the Patriots, where, impossible to make worse. Although, interestingly, back to the wound in the bow, I have, out of that loss, which was, it was, sports fans are a weird bunch.
Oh, yeah.
And even...
it's soap operas for men is how some women define it, but we really emotionally invest ourselves in this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Soaps or romantic or romance novels. But it's that whole, I've written about that a lot, the nature of sports fandom, which I would argue is inherent. I guess if you're the fan of a very, very successful team, again, like the Patriots or something of the last 20 years, but overall the Patriots are not a successful franchise if you go back to its origins, but obviously the last 20 years or 15 under Belichick have been insanely successful. But there is something masochistic about almost all fandom, like in the sense that you, first of all, are rooting for imaginary beings whom you're oddly invested in, who have nothing to do with your life. And second of all, human nature or human existence being what it is, your team is not particularly likely to win, except occasionally. So it's I guess that's the thing that I think is really crucial, is that, okay, the book owns my very, to me, relatively mild masochism. Like I'm somewhat emotionally excited by a certain kind of sadness or whatever, but perhaps slightly more extreme than that. But I think it's really part of the human animal in the sense that we all die ultimately. This incredibly crucial line by E.M. Sharon, the French Romanian philosopher, who says, and this might startle your listeners or it might be repellent to you, but he says, only one thing matters, learning to be the loser. It's like, whoa, only one thing matters, learning to be the loser? Wait a minute, we're here at 48th and Lex, the capital of capitalism right here. Winning is all that matters, Winning, the business of America is business. Winning. Never learn to be a loser. Look who's the president. Win, win, win.
Yeah.
He's obviously a total loser, which is crucial to Trump connecting with his entire base. But anyway, it's the second point. But anyway, the point being that we all ultimately become dust, as you may have heard. This is a very brief existence on Earth. So to me, the core masochism of any human being is a death wish. Part of us loves life, which is thanatos, eros. But part of us, and it's something that almost nobody can talk about, is like that we know we're destined to die, and that we're the only animal to our knowledge that is conscious of our mortality. I don't think there's any other animal that we know of that is aware throughout their entire life that they are destined to succumb to
mortality,
to nothingness.
Right.
And so the key point I want to get back to, though, Gil, is I have finished a documentary movie on Marshawn Lynch.
Okay. I noted
Do
here,
you have
and I realized we only have a few minutes to talk about it.
That we won't get,
we'll get back to. I'm sort of hoping you and I will be able to talk again.
Wouldn't that be fun?
If you're up for, you don't feel traumatized by this conversation.
No, hardly.
But yeah, I was going to ask if we could talk about it very briefly.
Sure.
The Lynch documentary.
If you want to talk about something else. But,
well, I was going to bring up how my father told me at 16 to get used to failing, which sort of ties into the fact that he was Romanian also might mean that there's some sort of ongoing
with Sharon.
threat.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, did you take that as a harsh thing or as useful paternal advice? Or did you take it as him
my old
being
man was an asshole.
a total jerk?
That's basically,
right.
That's where I'm coming from. Even
right.
now, while I'm helping take care of him in his mid-80s, there's always the...
He was a harsh dude.
No, he just didn't
He was an
care.
asshole.
Yeah, just didn't care. His idea was...
Get used to failing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. So anyway, that's sort of the baggage that I carry with me while you're looking at me in a suit heading off to pharmaceutical meetings and all this stuff.
That's a huge line, man.
Yeah.
Gil, get used to failing. Like, whoa, that's a pretty serious legacy. Yeah.
Right. So I carry baggage myself.
Exactly.
I just managed to cover it up well enough that,
You're masking it.
Right. But deep down, it's all there.
Exactly. So. Exactly.
But we'll talk about Lynch next time we get together,
totally.
which we need to do.
Totally.
But I did want to say, when it comes to the whole sports and masochism thing, in the 80s and 90s, I was a Knicks fan. And they let me down.
Talk about masochism.
Well, that was the thing. They let me down so often from the heights.
The finger roll.
Yes. And Charles Smith not going up strong against the Bulls and everything else that went wrong, and the brawls with the Riley Heat teams. I finally gave up and started cheering for the Nets back in New Jersey because they were terrible.
Right.
And there was never any hope that they were going to be good. And you just went so you'd see the other team play, and we had these 10-game ticket plans we'd go to. And then one off season, they traded for Jason Kidd. Mm-hmm. And they also offered us me and my pal, a half-season ticket plan, lower tier, $25 a game. And we thought, Jason Kidd, maybe we'll be a 500 team this year. It'd be nice. It'd be a little exciting, see a couple of wins happen. They end up running over the East, going to the NBA Finals, and that was more
that year. And
2001 into 2002, and Lakers, and then back to back. They went against the Spurs the next year. They destroyed the East for 2 years.
And each time got sort of decimated in the finals.
They
won
not? One game in the second series. The first against the Lakers, they got swept. And my pal, I was going to be traveling for another biotech show back then for Game 1 and Game 2, and a pal who I bought the tickets with, he said, well, I don't want to go to those games without you because, we've gone through this whole thing together.
Fun.
Why don't you sell them? Actually, it was game 3 and game 4 because the first 2 games were in L.A. And I sold them before the series began because I was afraid the Nets were going to get destroyed in games 1 and 2, and then games 3 and 4 wouldn't be worth anything, which is what happened.
Right.
So I actually made back $500 a piece for game 3 and game 4 tickets, which paid off for the entire regular season.
I love it.
But again, I went into it with I'd rather just follow a team that loses and has no hope. And then they became a winner, and that became really problematic. On top of the reason Jason Kidd got traded was because he was a little violent with his wife back in Phoenix. So, yeah, sports creates weird dynamics for us, even though we try and dumb it down and act like it's just a rah-rah.
As you probably know, I've written a lot about that. I wrote a book, Black Planet, which explores the whole nature of sports fandom, especially vis-a-vis race, and I wrote a book about Ichiro Suzuki. And
did you see the Mariners played this morning in Japan, and they had Ichiro in for the first 4 innings or so? I think they won. They were winning when I was checking earlier.
You are a sports fan if you're checking.
It's on my Twitter feed.
Japanese sports scores from last night, but and again, this Marshawn Lynch doc. That would be fun to talk about when the film comes out later this year.
I did see Ichiro his rookie year, and I had seats with a medical malpractice lawyer I knew in Seattle, so we were about six rows back from first base.
Whoa.
And he was up against the Indians, and they brought in the infield because they're trying to guard against. It was like a cricket bat. He just lifted the ball over Omar Vizquel's head and just dropped it right on the grass.
It's impossible.
This is his first year. I mean, he was a veteran in Japan, but we were all like, what? He just put the ball exactly where he wanted to.
There was I don't know if we're out of time, but there was this incredible moment where Mike Cameron was on second base, and I actually wrote about this in a New York Times Magazine profile about Ichiro that particular year. Cameron took about a couple steps off of second base. The second baseman or the shortstop moved a step or two to bird dog Cameron.
Yeah.
Ichiro hit it precisely to the very spot the second baseman had vacated. Like, that's impossible.
Right.
The guy's throwing a 98-mile screwball. How does someone do that? That's so beautiful,
And that's, again, the art to it. We know that there's physical gifts to it, but the level of devotion and rigor that goes into that stuff, I figure some writers get in terms of there's a discipline there. It's not just, he was freakishly good at
Exactly.
But anyway, we'll talk sports next time. It's the first day of baseball season, which is...
Is it really? Today?
Yeah, this is the opening day in Japan, and the rest of the league starts in a few days.
You mean the game actually counts?
Oh, yeah. The Mariners and I forget who else, they travel to Japan for the opening of the season.
See. And so Ichiro's playing in a sort of slightly honorary way.
Yeah, they put him in for the first few innings.
I love it.
Because it's his final season.
I love
it. One of the greatest Mariners ever.
Yeah.
So, anyway, we'll catch up on Marshawn Lynch and everything else next time you're on. David, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Great to chat, Gil. Thank you so much.
And that was David Shields. His new book is The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power, from Mad Creek Books, an imprint of the Ohio State University Press. It's a doozy, and I think you get some of that impression from our conversation, but I think it's an important book to read, to try to grok what's going on in our own relationships, if you get what I mean. You should also check out some of David's other books, like Reality Hunger, Manifesto, and Literature Saved My Life, which I also dug. And David's got a documentary coming out this spring, which we talked about at the very end, called Lynch, A History, about the great and enigmatic and polarizing Seattle Seahawks running back, Marshawn Lynch. Lynch is famously intense, except for the really goofy episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine that he did. And I can't wait to catch the documentary. As you heard, David and I are hoping to sit down for another session when he's in New York for the documentary. So we'll see, unless he was just being polite. You'll find out in a couple of months, I guess. David's website is davidshields.com, and both names are spelled as usual, David, SHIELDS. He's on Twitter and Instagram as _David Shields, with an underscore that just screams masochism. It just seems to totally fit with everything he was talking about in the episode, you know? Now, after we wrapped, I asked David, so, who you're reading? If you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. First quarter 2019 episode will be up soon, but this weekend just kind of got away from me. The fourth quarter 2018 episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Eddie Campbell, Nora Krug, Jason Lutz, Summer Pierre, David Small, Mark Derry, Michael Gerber, Angela Himsell, Kathy B. Graham, Shahar Pinsker, and Bill Cardilopoulos. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. And I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project that I'm starting to feel like I need to get to, but that's a time management thing, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one at my hotel room in New York City, where I was staying for a 4-day business conference, so I literally have no podcast-related expenses on this one, since work was paying for travel, hotel, meals, etc. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. Check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Michael Carroll, author of the new collection Stella Maris and Other Key West Stories. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, tell people on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.